You'll never catch me, Krabs. Not when I shift into maximum overdrive. Hi-ya! I knew I should have gotten the turbo.
There are many writers that stood the test of time with their creative and delegated writing skills. People like C.S. Lewis, Mark Twain, Lewis Carroll, and many others. But none have stood the test of time more so than the household name favorite that many take so much inspiration from, Stephen King. From his creative and yet twisted mind, Stephen King has brought home one of the greatest novels and the most greatest pieces of literature to ever exist from his archive. And it's sold millions upon millions of copies, making him probably the richest literary writer to ever exist in the history of literature. He's the king of all trades. Of course, Hollywood's got to cash in on the guy's success, so of course there's going to be a lot of adaptations. And I do mean there is a lot of them. Like, look at how many of them are there. It's insane how many adaptations there are. And in honor of the newest adaptation to come out, The Long Walk, I decided I wanted to talk about all of the Stephen King adaptations that have come out and give a short review for each one of them. Okay, maybe not every single one of them in this video. At least I want to talk about the ones that I watched prior to watching The Long Walk. And I'll talk about The Long Walk at the end of the video. There are some good ones and there are definitely some bad ones. But the video is about King himself, so there's no good without the bad. Without further ado, let's talk about Stephen King's best and worst adaptations. Now, I'm not going to talk about these films in any real particular order of release, just the ones that I can remember from the top of my head. And the one I'm going to start off with is the most recent film that came out this year, The Monkey. Now, this was based on a short story under the same name, The Monkey, but it's based loosely on that short story. But it does use a similar trope to what Stephen King does when it has an evil entity that's being used. When an evil entity is being used by a human individual against other people in order to get back at them in some way. And it, in a way, like, you see like who the real evil is. It's not just the tool, it's the one that's using the tool. And that trope is kind of used a lot in horror movies to date. It's not even really a trope, it's more of a conventional thing. So it's not a bad thing really. If anything, it helps move the plot forward. And with this film particularly, it's kind of like a satire on, like, let's say, like Final Destination. Like, you know how Final Destination takes itself way too seriously sometimes, even though it's silly in terms of its overall death count or like how people die in the most domino effect kind of way. The Monkey does somewhat similar, but at the same time, it's more random. But it's only because the monkey itself just picks its own victims without dealing with the consent or desire of what the one who's using the monkey in order to kill someone. Like, the monkey doesn't give a crap about what the user is trying to target. It's already selected a target. But like, that's what makes it so interesting. And the events that happen seem to center around Theo James's character, who tries to find his twin brother in order to stop it from happening. And things only seem to get worse from there the more he uses it. It's not like, the movie is directed by who also directed Longlegs. And while Longlegs is more of a serious psychological thriller, this one is more like a horror comedy tongue-in-cheek sort of movie. It's still bloody and gory, the same as you would expect it, like, from an R-rated horror movie, but that's why I like it. It doesn't take itself too seriously, and it's just a lot of fun to watch. I definitely recommend this if you haven't seen this already. The next one I'm going to talk about is Life of Chuck. Not exactly a horror movie, but a movie definitely worth watching. It's based on Stephen King's novel under the same name about a boy named Chuck who grows up learning life through his own eyes of wonder, magic, and sometimes even the horror of death itself. So I guess there's a bit of a small horroristic thing, I guess. But in terms of the genre itself, it's not really horror. It's more like just a sci-fi fantasy story. And it seems to center around this man named Chuck, also known as Charles Krantz. He basically runs the world before it completely ends, while the rest of the world tries to wonder how it moves forward. It follows the death of Charles, back from when he died to where he grew up. And it's an interesting perspective in terms of how he sees the world and how we can perceive the world itself. And the biggest thing that they bring up is I contain multitudes. What that means is I have control of my own life and I control how I see it. It all comes down to perspective. Sometimes the good and the bad is somewhat absolute and inevitable, to say the least. But it all depends on how we see our own perspective. But waiting for those moments to happen aren't exactly the easiest. As they say in the film, waiting is the hard part. Right, it's a feel-good movie that I recommend to anyone who just likes to watch those kind of films. The Running Man follows Arnold Schwarzenegger as a wrongfully committed criminal who's now thrusted into a game run by one of the hosts from Family Feud. That's a brilliant casting choice, actually. Why didn't you do that for Steve Harvey in the remake? Anyway, it's kind of what you'd expect in the story of these life dystopian futures in America, where they fight for life and death. Kind of like what The Long Walk or like Squid Game is. Like, their main goal is to survive for potentially a big prize, if they survive, and then ultimately it comes down to who's the last standing. Like, even though there's not very much that stands out about this film, you can at least enjoy Arnold Schwarzenegger's catchy one-liners that they're always a blast to listen to. And knowing that the remake is done by one of my favorite directors, Edgar Wright, I have no doubt that that film is going to be a masterpiece. Pet Sematary is just another example of using a dark entity when you're not supposed to, but to your own selfish means. In this case, it's a father who's trying to keep his family happy when they realize their cat died the second they moved into a new town. But then they learn there's a cemetery that they can bury their cat into that'll bring it back to life, but with a few side effects. That it's all evil and shit. Then they go through tragedy and watch the youngest son unfortunately pass away by getting hit by a truck. They have a surprisingly disturbingly sad funeral that turned even worse when he takes the dead body and buries it in the cemetery in the attempt at bringing it back to life. But much like what happened to the cat, the boy turned evil and shit. This was definitely probably one of the weirdest horror movies. It's not undisturbing in a way that it was intending to, but on its own, it's weird. It's definitely really weird. I guess if you like that kind of weird stuff, I guess you can watch it at your own leisure. But if you're not, then you can probably just skip this one. It's not really that big of a deal. But personally, I'll take that over the shitty remake any day. Growing up, I never really knew the basis or the emotional impact that psychological horror films can have. I had never seen Jacob's Ladder. I'd never seen Silence of the Lambs or The Machinist before watching what I consider a great psychological horror film, 1408. Again, based from a Stephen King novel, 1408 follows John Cusack, who checks into a hotel room called, 1408. Samuel Jackson, as the keeper of the hotel, tells him not to go in as it dangerously messes with your mind. But Cusack insists and decides to go in for himself, thinking that it's not a big deal. But with all of his emotions and all of his trauma that he has to relive throughout his entire life, brings him to the most psychologically emotional wreck as he goes through every single trial that he already previously went through. It turns to be really sad and really tragic to watch, in a good way. When I was growing up, this was the first psychological horror film I had ever watched, and I keep it in a special place in my heart, knowing that this is what introduced me to all the rest that came before. If it wasn't for this film, I would have never known about those psychological horror films, and I'm glad that this film introduced me to such a impactfully scary and horrifying subgenre that definitely deserves its place in film. When it comes to remakes, there's always an intent to quote-unquote try to be as good as the original or try to replicate what the original did, but in reality it's just there as a cash grab from the popularity of the original film, which causes that remake to fall short almost very frequently. I always thought the intent of remakes was to improve from the original film in terms of where it may have fallen short on. When I see something like It, the one that came out in 2017, that's the perfect example of improving from the original source material. Not from the book, but from the miniseries. It and It Chapter 2 do correctly are what the miniseries falls short on, in terms of the depth with these characters who are being terrorized by a killer clown, a bunch of asshole bullies, and just Derry, Maine itself. Allows us to understand their characters in a deeper meaning, other than just, you know, kids trying to live out in the middle of summer, just trying to have fun. Of course they can't, because, you know, all the three things I mentioned earlier. But I find it a lot more meaningful and has a lot more depth when they actually focus on the kid characters in the first movie, as opposed to in the miniseries where they just keep going back and forth with adult characters and the kid characters, which didn't really make a lot of sense to me. I just felt if you just kept it more linear, it would actually make more sense. I know they ended up doing it in It Chapter 2, but the transitions made a lot more sense, not just because with the casting, but also just with the transitions. The transitions were actually done a lot better than, say, in the miniseries. And that's something that they definitely made up for that in terms of improvements. Overall, I think It and It Chapter 2 are far superior from the miniseries, just for those reasons alone. And hopefully Welcome to Derry will at least match that sort of quality. And finally, for this video, I'd like to talk about one more film. The recent film that came out this weekend, The Long Walk. Directed by the same guy who directed The Hunger Games, which is ironic because he's also doing young adults doing a game to the death sort of thing. What makes it so interesting here is that while it is a level of competition, it also is a level of just heart strength, and not just the physical body, but also the mind and the heart itself, going about all the hardships in your life and going that long stretch. Like, knowing it's going to be a long distance without any real finish line, because that's how the competition works. But in the end, even they said it in the film, it's not always about the finish line. It's always about the moments that you spend within each step. Kind of like it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. A pretty simple lesson to be learned with that film. But it's also a very important one that a lot of people seem to not really recognize, especially of this generation. And I'm talking more so about people like of my generation. Like, I'm a millennial. I'm 31 years old. A lot of us, and especially Gen Z, a lot of us think we go a long path hoping to find success in our endeavors just based on basic hardships, and we always think we're owed that because, you know, we go through a hard day's work every single day. Like, where's the end to it, or where's the reward by the end of it? And the reward is, well, we don't really know that for sure until we actually appreciate the journey itself. And that in of itself is the reward, like, when it comes down to it. And that's kind of what I got from this film. And that's just really something that I can hold on to for a long time. And I think a lot of people who watch this film will hold on to. At least I hope they do. But if you haven't seen the movie already, that's kind of the gist of what it is. I guess that's kind of a spoiler, sort of. But get a feel for it by watching the film yourself, and trust me, you won't regret it. And that's really all I gotta say about Stephen King in terms of adaptations I've seen so far. I know Edgar Wright's Running Man is coming out pretty soon, and Running Man again is a Stephen King adaptation, but it's just a remake from the Schwarzenegger version. I might talk more about Stephen King around that time when that film comes out. But so for now, we're just gonna leave the video where it is here, since these are really the only films I know by heart and from memory in terms of talking about them in a small bit of depth. I think I'll talk more about him until then. For now, I think we could just end things here. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.